My name is Howard Libet, and I am the Executive Director of the Baltimore Jewish Council. We are honored to be partnering with the Jewish Museum of Maryland and the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education for tonight's program. A special thanks to our generous donors for helping us put on this important series. As many of you know, over the past year, our community here in Baltimore has undergone a rigorous effort to focus on anti-Semitism, developing a communal definition and statement, as well as a community action plan that we are putting into effect. I believe the links to see the statement and action plan are both going to be shared in the chat, or you can find them on our BJC website. For both the museum and the Baltimore Jewish Council, the programs that we are able to offer and the work we do for our community are only possible thanks to the support of the Associated Jewish Federation of Baltimore. If you've not yet made your pledge for this year, you still have some time, a couple more weeks. Please consider it so we can keep sharing the kind of educational programming that we hope you will learn from tonight. Now for the introductions. Judy Margles is the director of the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education in Portland, Oregon. During her tenure, she has managed the merger of the Oregon Holocaust Resource Center and the Oregon Jewish Museum, and the purchase of a permanent home for the museum, which opened in 2017. Previously, she served as curator at the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry. Judy speaks frequently at conferences and professional meetings. Her essay, Cross-Cultural Engagement at the Oregon Jewish Museum, appears in Global Mobilities, Refugees, Exiles, and Immigrants, published by Routledge in 2017. Judy is past chair of the board of the Council of American Jewish Museums and served on the board of the American Alliance of Museums between 2013 and 2019. Eric Ward is a nationally recognized expert on the relationship between authoritarian movements, hate violence, and preserving inclusive democracy. In his 30-plus years of civil rights career, he's worked with community groups, government and business leaders, human rights advocates, and philanthropy as an organizer, director, program officer, consultant, and board member. The recipient of the Peabody Facebook Futures Media Award, Eric's widely quoted writings and speeches are credited with key narrative shifts. He currently serves as executive director of Western States Center, senior fellow with Southern Poverty Law Center and Race Forward, and co-chair for the Proteus Fund. And as someone who has heard him speak a number of times, I can say you're in for quite an educational opportunity tonight. And with that, let me turn it over to you, Judy. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And thanks to the Baltimore Jewish Council, the Jewish Museum of Maryland for including the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education in this great program. Hello, Eric. So lovely
Judy.
to see you. Really good to be with you this late afternoon, early evening. So the format tonight will be, I'm just going to be in conversation, asking Eric some questions. I'm sure those of you listening in have your own questions, and I urge you to be thinking about them and put them in the Q&A. We'll have some time at the end for your questions. But to get started, Eric, some of us, I think, who are listening today, we know you fairly well. We've had the privilege of hearing you speak before. For others, this will be an introduction. And it's really wonderful to have this program where we've got this lovely mix of East Coast and West Coast audiences, and possibly some people in between. You're really one of these rare individuals, if I might say. You're so uniquely situated by your past experience and the work you're doing today to understand the roots of white nationalism. So how about, by way of introduction, tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you came to be so specifically educated about this movement.
Absolutely. And Judy, first of all, it's just incredibly wonderful to see you. And before we even answer that question, you can take some credit for my education. Look, I grew up in Southern California, and I grew up, I'd say working poor, but it was poorer than that. And I grew up at a time of great change in Los Angeles and Long Beach, California. I grew up at the time of desegregation in the public schools. And as you know, no good deed goes unpunished in the world. And so too it was desegregation. Right? The desegregation of public schools benefited my life in some really significant ways, but it also was a horrifying experience. I was often the victim of hate crimes and intimidation and harassment as I walked to and from school after I got off the school bus. wasn't by kids, right? These were adults. I've told these stories before, and I wasn't alone. This was happening to lots of students who were going to and from school. People shouting at us from cars, revving their engines, threatening us. And look, we should understand it happened so frequently and so quickly. I never once thought about telling my mom or an adult or a teacher. It quickly just meant what it was to go back and forth to school. I remember in ninth grade having enough and standing my ground against some older adults who were trying to harass me and other ninth graders. I'm not going to wax poetically or draw any myth. I think everyone knows exactly how that ended up. But it was a moment where I decided that I wasn't going to run anymore, that I was done with bullying, the bullying of myself or others. I've worked hard since then to always try to be better at that. But look, eventually, I'm jumping over the whole music, punk stuff and Sublime. I'm going to jump all over away from that for a second. But, there is a point where in Southern California, it was simply becoming dangerous to be a person of color, and particularly to be a young man of color. The war on drugs, which we now know from tapes out of the Nixon White House, was a war on Black people. That is how White House senior administrators described the war on drugs at that time and its purpose. We know that things like crack cocaine and crystal meth were running loose on the streets of Southern California. It just was no longer a safe place. So I had two friends who were moving up to the University of Oregon, go Ducks. And three of us joined them, right? We left Los Angeles. There were no jobs in LA. Life was tough. It was becoming dangerous. And so five of us came up to Eugene, Oregon. And at the time that I came up to Eugene, Oregon to actually find my life, just ahead of me, another individual had moved up. His name was Richard Butler. And Richard Butler was a pastor, and he moved his church up to the Pacific Northwest to a place called Hayden Lake. And he named his church Church of Jesus Christ Christian Aryan Nations. And he taught three things. The first was that Jews were the literal children of Satan. The second was that people of color were subhuman, right, or chattel. And the third was that Northern Europeans were the true descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. This was a group that was engaged in promoting and creating environments that ended in violence. The murder of a Jewish radio talk show host by the name of Alan Berg, who was gunned down outside of his home for arguing with Holocaust deniers on the air, and also the murder, beating death of Mulugeta Sarah in the streets of Portland, Oregon, an immigrant student who was attacked by racist skinheads and beaten to death with a baseball bat on his way home from work, right? We knew that we needed to respond. And one of the things I noticed, Judy, how I came to understand anti-Semitism was on all the flyers that were being distributed. These were vilely racist. You probably remember these flyers. Vilely anti-Muslim, homophobic, right? Xenophobic, everything you could imagine. But at the end of the day, there always seemed to be some reference to Jews on it, whether it was some racist anti-Semitic caricature, whether it was slogans like Zionist occupational government, right? Or the use of the Star of David or the yarmulke, right? The kippah. There always seemed some reference to Jews, and often positioned as the puppet masters over people of color. So the truth is I came to understand anti-Semitism because I wanted to know what drove this movement that was bringing so much violence to our region. And the answer lied with anti-Semitism. And that's how I came to begin to engage in that conversation with others.
Thank you. I think it would be really helpful, Eric. Let's sort of define some of the terms we're going to be using. So we know we've hear the term white nationalism, we hear the term white supremacy. Can you help us understand what each mean and what the connection between the two?
Yeah. So you remember I was just talking about the Aryan nations, and I was saying, yeah, they believe Jews are literal children of Satan. people of color, particularly African Americans, are subhuman or without souls or chattel, right? Or that white Northern Europeans are the true descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, and the United States is their New Jerusalem, right? We could roll our eyes and say that's really way out there and ridiculous. But here's the thing, right? Hate groups don't bring racism or anti-Muslim bigotry or anti-Semitism or transphobia, other forms of bigotry to our communities. They only organize, right, the hatred that already exists. So the truth is to understand the threat of the white nationalist movement, we have to understand where they organize their bigotry, and they draw their bigotry out of historical notions that we sometimes accept as conventional wisdom. Look, none of us are at fault. None of us were here 500 years ago. None of us were here 100 years ago. But this is the joined history of the United States. It was founded upon an ideology called white supremacy. And white supremacy was based off the idea that white people, right, that people, let's first, I'm going to take white out of it, that people were superior based off of skin color or inferior based off of their skin color. No other qualification except skin color. That was the concept of white supremacy and white superiority in this country. It was used to justify three things. The first was a stolen lands and resources of indigenous people in this country through genocide. The second was a system of slavery called chattel slavery, a particular brutal form of chattel slavery, none that had ever existed before and none that has existed to this day. And the third, we don't often talk about, was the control of women, the control of sexuality in society. It was these three things, based off of convincing people that they were superior just off their skin color, that allowed the formation of the society, and in fact, built much of the economics of the society. It is why the United States is such a huge economic power. 500 years of free, exploited labor does quite well for an economic system. That's part of our history. Along comes the civil rights movement in 1965, and it challenges white supremacy as the rule of law. And it successfully defeats white supremacy as the rule of law. I'm not saying white supremacy doesn't exist anymore. What I'm saying is now it is contested terrain. We understand who we are as a nation, as a country, through other lenses, right? Not through this primary racist lens of black and white. But look, imagine you're an art segregationist, right? You believe in Jim Crow, you believe in separate but equal, you believe in white superiority. How do you come to terms with that you lost against people, black folks, that you see as inferior? And this is where white nationalism begins to take root. In short, Judy, if white supremacy is a system of exploitation, white nationalism became a social movement responding to the defeat of its defeat to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. It was never going to allow that it lost to black people. As I said, folks could only see black people as inferior. They simply weren't going to say, well, I guess I was wrong about that. So they constructed a new narrative, a new folktale. They borrowed from the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, an anti-Semitic false narrative that had been used to justify the Holocaust and pogroms in Europe for decades. Borrowing from that, they constructed their own narrative. They didn't lose to black people. They lost to a nefarious Jewish conspiracy, right, that sought to enslave white people and to destroy the white race. In short, if white supremacy is about exploitation, white nationalism became about ethnic cleansing, the removal of people of color and Jews from the United States altogether. The white nationalist movement doesn't seek to take us back to that system of exploitation. What it seeks to do is to engage in ethnic cleansing. That's the difference between white nationalism and white supremacy. Folks often then say, but is it really worth drawing a distinction? Isn't that really a distinction without a difference? And my response is the reason why we should distinguish between the two is to think about it in a parallel conversation. Look, both a cow and a Big Mac contain beef. But when you drop your Big Mac on the ground, you don't call a veterinarian, right? In the same way, the tools we need to respond to this growing social movement called white nationalism aren't the same tools that we need to address systemic racial discrimination in our society. But the other piece we have to note is this. In the new white nationalist construct, right, Jews are placed as a racialized other, not a religious other, right? And Jews are not seen as white within the white nationalist framework. In fact, white nationalists frame Jews as an existential enemy, right, that must be wiped out from the United States. It is that existential war against the Jewish community, grounded in anti-Semitism, that has caused damage not to just the Jewish community, but to other communities as well. Some examples of this: we're very familiar with the incidents that happened at the Tree of Life, the targeting of Jewish worshipers in Pittsburgh, but we're less familiar with the anti-Semitism that drove the mass shootings of Latinos at a Walmart in El Paso, or drove a killer to step into a church in Charleston, South Carolina, opening fire on African-American worshipers, or the anti-Semitism that drove a killer to step into a Sikh house of worship, opening fire and wounding and murdering others. The truth is that when it comes to mission-oriented hate crimes, planned hate crimes, what is now being called domestic terrorism, the majority of them are actually driven by anti-Semitism. It's often why I say two things, Judy, and then I'll be quiet. The first is we have to understand that anti-Semitism is as much of a threat to non-Jews as it is to Jews. The second is that, as my friend Tima says, anti-Semitism is anti-Black because anti-Semitism is employed in the United States to deny Black people and other people of color legitimate grievance, right, and their own agency. It says that we as people of color are only being stirred up by our quote unquote Jewish masters. It is that anti-Semitism that blocks this country from moving forward together. And that's why we have to confront it.
No, thank you. And I do want to come back. I want to pick up the thread of anti-Semitism. I think it's a really important part of this conversation today. I do want to pick up on the civil rights movement still.
Yeah.
If you could help us understand. So, you know, the 60s was this time of the expansion of civil rights and equal rights. And if we sort of fast forward even to the, you know, I think the question is it is really hard for us to understand how we got to where we are today. You've got the civil rights movement. I think to the 1990s when you were actually literally fighting skinheads on the streets of Portland. How did we get from Selma to Charlottesville? Like it's a question, but what on earth happened that we are here given the 1960s, given even the work that you were doing in the 90s?
We won in the 1960s. That is what got us to this point. What we're seeing is a reaction, right, to the victory of the civil rights movement. The problem is that because of the intersecting nature of white supremacy and white nationalism, white supremacy socializes us not to see white nationalism as a threat. Here's a good example of the way that white supremacy and white nationalism interact with one another. Case study one, January 6, Washington, D.C., right? Over 140 law enforcement officers injured, 5 people killed after an attempted takeover, right, of the People's House, right, the United States Capitol. Very little law enforcement response. Hours for the National Guard to be mobilized. Now imagine for a second, right? Law enforcement weren't even in riot gear, right, on that day. People had known for months, and we're not going to pretend folks didn't know. We all knew for months exactly what was going to play out on January 6th. How was it possible that law enforcement was unprepared? How is it possible that it allowed 140 law enforcement officers to be injured? Now let's stop for a second. I want everyone to close their eyes, right? Close your eyes and imagine for a second there was going to be a large Black Lives Matters protest out in front of the nation's capital. Imagine, how would we be responding if 140 law enforcement officers were targeted? Black Lives Matters activists invaded the nation's capital, threatening the lives of congresspeople who are engaging, right, in the constitutional practice of the transfer of power in this country. We would not be responding in the way that we are responding now, right? That is white supremacy. White supremacy, left unchecked, is going to kill democracy in the United States. It is that white supremacy, that idea that there is no other threat except for people of color in this country, that leaves all of us vulnerable. It's why I told the White House that racism is the national security threat in the United States. But how has this trended over time? It's been able to trend because it's moved from the margins to the mainstream. I think about fashion shows, Judy. I used to be a big fan of watching the Fashion Minute on CNN when CNN first used to come out. I think they did it on Fridays, and they would go to London or Rio de Janeiro or Tokyo, right, New York, and they'd show off the latest fashion. And I had a love-hate relationship with the Fashion Minute because I used to love to sit there and watch those fashions come down the runway and then exclaim arrogantly, I hate that, right? No one's gonna wear that. That's ridiculous. Those fashions, who would wear a design like that? That's so way out there. And I was right? Most of the time, those fashions aren't worn, maybe to the Oscars, maybe to a big awards event, but that's the last time you see them. But I began to notice something. And as I was going to clothing stores to buy my own clothes, the fashions I had seen coming down the runways, those ones I was calling extreme, right, and way out there, no one was ever going to wear them, began to influence the type of clothing that was being sold on the clothing racks. Look, in the same way that the fashion industry seeks to influence what happens in the cultural mainstream of America, right, the clothes we wear, the colors that we like, so too is the white nationalist movement sought to influence what is happening in the American mainstream. It is deeply disturbed by America's motion towards inclusion, equity, and opportunity in the society. And it has sought to disrupt it, right? Since the days of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. It hasn't gone away. It is slowly built like all social movements build. This whole 1960 civil rights movement I'm talking about. Well, most of those 1960 civil rights victories happened when? In the mid 1950s, right? Before the 1960s ever started. Rosa Parks, Brown versus the Board of Education, Little Rock, right? Medgar Evers, right? The list goes on, right? But let's also remember, when you talk to historians, what we know is that the civil rights movement actually started in the 1940s. And so we have to understand social movements have long arcs. So too does the white nationalist movement. And the white nationalist movement has been successful primarily because we refuse to pick up the mirror and look into it. The truth is that the white nationalist movement aren't better organizers. They're not smarter. They don't have more momentum. They don't have more creativity. Look, the civil rights movement in this country has won more for white America, right? I'm gonna say that again. The 1960 civil rights movement has delivered more for white America than the white nationalist movement ever has or ever will. But the problem is that those of us who believe in democracy, who believe in inclusion, we have been too quiet. And it is in that space that the white nationalist movement has stepped in. We are in a time of great change. And in times of great change come great anxiety. Think of change management. There are whole treaties and books and seminars that are written about change management. But here we are, as singer Brad Paisley, a country music singer, says, right? Revolution, right, happens every day, meaning we are always in motion. So too is the white nationalist movement. Look, when we first started confronting the white nationalist movement in the 80s and 90s, right, these were folks who were physically attacking us at shows, right? They weren't coming to just listen to the music. They were coming to threaten us. They were coming to intimidate us, right? And we had to fight for our lives. There were no adults that were coming to protect us. There were no police who were coming to protect us, right? Club owners weren't coming to protect us. So we did what we thought we knew what to do. There were no adults to tell us, right, that there were better ways of managing this change and managing hate. So we relied on our fists. And look, a lot of harm was caused, but it was all we knew. Now we all know better. We're adults now. We understand what we are seeing. We understand these big lies, whether it is about election fraud, whether it is replacement theory, right? Whether it is QAnon, right? Whether it is Antifa, or whether it's critical race theory. It's the same big lie that we've been listening to for over 5 years. But we have to understand these big lies kill, right? And they cause damage. The attack on critical race theory, right, will bring about the same destruction that the attack on George Soros brought to the Jewish community. It will bring the same damage, right, that undercutting the election process brought on January 6th to this country. It will bring the same destruction that we saw against those who denied COVID. We watched elected officials create an environment where people were giving bleach to their children to drink. There were individuals who tried to bomb a Jewish hospital in Kansas City and bomb a senior elder care center in Massachusetts. Those are the violence that come from the big lie. And we are still in the midst of the big lie. But here's the deal. Primarily at the center of all those big lies lies anti-Semitism. How do we untwine these big lies if we refuse to engage a form of bigotry that is so influential in our society?
Yeah, so it really makes me want to ask you about leadership and how our mainstream political parties have failed us. And I'll just, I do want to say last week, for those of you not from Oregon, that democracy prevailed here last week. There was an insurrection at our state capitol on December 21st, and one of the House representatives, Mike Neerman, who had opened a door to let the thugs in, he was expelled from the House. I will credit Eric and his organization, Western State Center. They were a leading voice in articulating why the expulsion was necessary and gathering support through letter writing and testimony. Democracy worked. Oregon is I think, perhaps the outlier here, because nationally we have this change in administration. We are now once again reminded what empathetic leadership can look like, and it feels so good. But we're still confronted with the Lauren Boeberts, the Marjorie Taylor Greens, and of course Donald Trump, who seems to hold quite a bout of power. So, what are we just failed at leadership? Do we have to become vigilantes? How do we move forward?
We're not failed at leadership, but we fail at closing ranks over things that are difficult and hard to talk about. Look, we have to understand that while most of the anti-Semitic violence that's occurred in this country has been at the far right, right? And we forget that. We forget that the attacks on the attacks on the Jewish community that occurred, particularly targeting Orthodox communities in New York a year ago, right? Or a little over a year ago. We have to understand that at the end of the day, right, anti-Semitism isn't originated by the far right in this country, by the authoritarians, right? It exists in society, and that means it can be tapped into across the political spectrum. We can't afford to give oxygen to anti-Semitism in this moment. Historically, as I understand it, anti-Semitism has primarily been used for two reasons, right? The first is to undercut the concept and credibility of democracy. And the second, right, is to create a buffer between the haves and the have-nots in a society in moments of great inequality. And that is how I see anti-Semitism being employed in the United States right now. it means all of us have to close ranks, right? And we have to be adamant that there is no space, no room for anti-Semitism anywhere across the political spectrum. But to get there means we have to lean in. We have to have very difficult and hard conversations with one another. And we have to be able to have the space to make mistakes, right? There is a difference between anti-Semites like David Duke and a Louis Farrakhan who intentionally try to tap into anti-Semitism in order to organize political or cultural power, right? And those who simply dabble in anti-Semitism or in tropes because they're unaware that they exist, right? That is why we have to continue the conversation on anti-Semitism. But look, our leaders spend way too much time trying to be punitive, right? When people stumble, right? Rather than opening up the space and giving folks the tools to make better decisions. That's because we primarily see anti-Semitism as a behavior, right? Rather than a system. But the truth is anti-Semitism, at least the most popular form of anti-Semitism, as crafted in the narrative of the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, is not about behavior. It is anti-Semitism, the hatred of Jews as a political ideology. And we have to push our leaders to step into this fight. Many are nervous because they're afraid of saying something wrong. Many are nervous because they're not Jewish, right? And they're outside of the Jewish community and they're afraid of making an error. But look, none of us can afford to sit around and wait around till we get this right on anti-Semitism. We have to start leaning in and understanding exactly the impact it has on all of us.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And I think we're going to put skin in the game, your absolutely groundbreaking article from 2017
Thank you.
In the chat. And if everybody hasn't read it, I would urge you to read it, because there you do articulate much of what you're just saying now, that anti-Semitism is unique among conspiracy theories, right?
That's right.
It's used for so much more than just street level hatred of Jews. It's used, it's kind of the all-encompassing explanation of what is wrong with the world, right? And I also really appreciate, and maybe you'll say something a bit more about this, is you do say, and I think you said it earlier, that anti-Semitism is not a crisis for the Jewish community, but a crisis for all communities. So perhaps you want to say something more about that. And then I don't know whether you want to sort of talk about anti-Semitism. Is it one of other isms we're all dealing with right now? Do you think it's unique amongst conspiracy theories?
It is, someone will get mad at me for saying this, but it is the motherlode of conspiracy theories. Look, in terms of a form of hatred, right? Anti-Jewish bigotry, right? Of which anti-Semitism is one thread, is one of the oldest forms of bigotry, and probably the only thing, consistent form of bigotry. And the only thing that predates it is misogyny, right? The hatred of women, as I understand it. Mm-hmm. We should also understand, right? We often don't talk about this, and we can get into why I think the Jewish community is hesitant to acknowledge anti-Semitism as a racialized form of bigotry in America, but we'll get there in a second. Look, we have to understand that anti-Semitism, the racialized form of the hatred of Jews, was also used to construct white supremacy, right? The form of anti-Semitism that took place in the Iberian Peninsula, right, was based off the idea of Jews being a racialized other. It is almost accurate to say that the Jewish community in the Iberian Peninsula may have been the first victims of white supremacy, right, as an ideology. That's why anti-Semitism is so unique, but there's another reason that it's unique. All forms of bigotry carry different purposes. And as I said before, right, the bigotry that Black people face in the United States is based off of two goals. The first was historical exploitation of a group of people. How could you dehumanize, right? How could you exploit people? Well, you first have to other them and dehumanize. You have to place them in a position where they become deserving, right, of the discrimination and exploitation that they are receiving. That is anti-Black racism in the United States. That is not the nature of anti-Semitism. So often when I say anti-Semitism is a form of racism, people react as somehow I'm comparing it exactly to the experience of Black folks, right? That we experience. That's not it. We're much more sophisticated than that, folks, and that's an attempt to silence a conversation, not have a conversation. The truth is anti-Semitism, right, serves a function. It is been referred to as punching up, right? Jews are placed, right, as a powerful other, right? Often almost supernatural forms of power and conspiracy within the anti-Semitic framework. What I mean by that is that Jews are often placed, right, as the barrier towards equality in a society. And that's the danger of anti-Semitism. We've all seen data, or maybe you haven't, but data consistently shows that anti-Semitism shows up in a much more hardened way, right? It's often framed as it shows up more, but I actually think it shows up in a much more explicit way. I don't think it shows up any more in the Black community than other communities, but it shows up more explicitly, right? And folks ask me, why are Black folks more susceptible to anti-Semitism? Well, the answer is because that is how anti-Semitism was designed to work. Anti-Semitism was designed, right, to be an escape valve, right, for those who have very little power in a society. You can't attack the elites, but you're allowed to take your anger, your frustration out on this other minority community, the Jews. That's how anti-Semitism worked and functioned in Europe during the pogroms. And that is how it's primarily been utilized here in the United States as well.
And earlier you mentioned replacement theory. And
yes,
it's a central notion of white nationalism. Jews seem to have a central role in replacement theory. Why don't you just say a little bit about what it is? What is the role, the purported role?
So replacement theory is a pseudo scientific theory, right? That's been perpetuated by the white nationalist movement. In short, in street lingo, it would be called white genocide, right? Or in the crass language of the marchers in Charlottesville during the Unite the Right rally, they chanted it as Jews will not replace us. It is a conspiracy that teaches that Jewish elites, often framed under the term globalist, right, or international financiers, right, are utilizing immigration, right, and refugees into the United States in order, in the words of white nationalists, to swamp and to wipe out the white race. That is how replacement theory has been framed in its most crass forms. Shockingly, replacement theory, which has been rampant within the white nationalist movement, got tapped into by elected officials, right, both at the national and federal and local levels for nearly a 3-year period. Placed at the center of that was an anti-Semitic trope, right? A Jewish philanthropist by the name of George Soros, right, who was somehow responsible, right, for all of this, right? He and other globalists read Jews into that theory. The rhetoric got so heated that eventually a white nationalist who picked up on the energy of the moment utilized it to walk into a Jewish house of worship and open fire on worshipers. We watched another individual utilize it in the attack on 3 Muslim sites, right, in Christchurch, New Zealand. And we watched another individual in Germany utilize the same narrative in order to drive that argument. But it wasn't just Pittsburgh here. It was also Poway. It was also Gilroy, El Paso, and other places. In short, replacement theory is an anti-Semitic trope, right, that argues that Jews are secretly trying to destroy white Christendom. If that sounds familiar, It should, because it comes right out of the pages of the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, created in 1908.
Well, do put your questions in the Q&A. I think I'm going to try and sneak in 2 questions of my own and then move to audience questions. I wanted to ask you about social media and its role. There's so much predatory online behavior, and I think we could learn perhaps from, if you have any tips for reliable sources of information. Do you have recommendations for websites we might look at? How do we recognize potentially dangerous, violent, objectionable sources? There's so much out there.
Yeah, we want to keep an eye on organizations like Allied Media Project, also a good source for disinformation and misinformation that's being promulgated out there. The Southern Poverty Law Center, of course, is another site that monitors that. The Anti-Defamation League, right? There are a number of groups who are keeping an eye out on misinformation and disinformation. You know, one of those, maybe we'll get to it, is critical race theory. For those who've been caught up in the critical race theory debates, we should understand we are being caught up in a conspiracy theory that is grounded in a big lie, one that is actually rooted, interesting enough, in anti-Semitism. But we have to be cautious in this moment, and to understand that online social media platforms, and there's a strong libertarian streak in me, and a strong constitutionalist streak. I am a hardened First Amendment guy. That's where I stand. But I'm going to be honest with folks. I never thought I would say this, but the internet may be the worst thing that has ever happened to humanity. It is, there is no way to moderate it, and there is no way to distinguish the big lie from the truth. And the big lie, unchecked, easily becomes conventional wisdom. And all of us have been victims to that at some point. But there's another challenge with social media platforms, which is we don't all see the same thing, right? Recently, after the events in Gaza, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, right? I had many friends out of the Jewish community saying, why aren't folks of color, why aren't Black folks speaking out against anti-Semitism, right? And my response was, actually, folks are speaking out. You're just not seeing it. You're not seeing it because, look, if we both turn on Netflix right now, we are both going to be presented with a different grouping of movies, right? My partner and I are watching one of the same shows, and the advertisement, right? The image for the show is completely different depending if you go to her account, right, or my account. That is algorithms, right? Trying to understand and try to attract us. We have to understand it's not a perfect system. So it often does things to manipulate us, right? In ways that we would not normally be manipulated. So we're not getting the same information. We're not seeing the same thing. And the third thing is profit, right? These social media streams make their profit by keeping us online. And what better way to keep people online than to get them arguing with one another, right? When you're mad, when you're angry, you're more likely to start ranting on social media, drawing profits. And it is those three things that have made social media platforms very difficult. But look, I'm not a person who believes, right, that you can stuff things back in a jar once they're out. The internet and social media are with us. They are a permanent feature of our world. So we have to do other things. The first is we have to retrain ourselves, right, to understand, right, that we can't just be dependent on what we see on social media, right, in terms of understanding what is happening in the world. The second is we have to keep pressure on our elected officials to rein in these social media companies. Look, this is not an unfixable problem. They can fix it if they choose to. And the third is it's time to have a conversation. if this has become the main way that we have discourse with one another, right? Should it be driven by profit only, right? Maybe it's time for the United States Postal Service, right, to have its own platform so Americans can actually have honest conversations, right, that aren't filtered away based off of whether we're going to make these social media platforms profit. The last thing I'll just say, Judy, is look, if we want to deal with the internet adults, right? I'm talking to the adults on here right now. We want to actually deal with the internet. We got to invest in young people, right? Stop policing young people. Stop being punitive to young people and start equipping them, because those are the folks who are most likely to solve this issue. And I got to tell you, they are under-resourced on these issues. There is an alt-right online program called PragerU that just preys on young people. It's a soft entry point to the white nationalist movement, to the alt-right. And look, Judy, PragerU probably has a $1 to $2 million advertising budget each year, right? And we give our kids a $200 grant, and we think that it's sufficient. Look, if we're serious about this, it's time for us to understand democracy is under siege, and we either step up and defend democracy, or we should all be clear after January 6th how this plays out. These are folks who are very serious about overthrowing the United States of America. These are folks who are very serious about authoritarian rule, right? And underlying that within its ideology and worldview is deep anti-Semitism, deep racism.
You have been perhaps less than cheery in the last few minutes, but I am going to ask you a question I've always wanted to ask you and give you a chance to sort of think about this. I've always described you to people when I talk about you as a perennial optimist. I don't think it's incorrect. I don't know whether it's, it goes back to your days as a community organizer, but where do you get your hope? How are you not cowed by fear when you know there's so much extremism in our midst? And, is there something you can tell all of us who are listening to you today, how we become more aware, how we can respond to the problem, how we can hold hope?
Yeah. Look, I am an optimist. Folks are probably listening to this right now and going, wait, what? But I really am an optimist. Look, we're not losing, right? We are not losing. We are actually winning. And it is because we are winning, right, that we are facing this backlash. It wouldn't be happening if we were losing, trust me, right? And so we have won. Now, how did we win? Right? We won because really courageous folks, right, in the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, right, built a strong civil rights coalition, right, that was Black-led and supported by lots of groups, including the Jewish community, right, who really showed up, right, in the civil rights struggle, found its own skin in the game. There's a myth, right, that the Jewish community showed up. We're going to help those poor Black people, and that's how people often relate this story now, right? That somehow the Jewish community showed up just in an altruistic way. I reject that. I think the Jewish community showed up because it had skin in the game, right? It had a vested interest because it had just survived one of the greatest genocides to ever take place, right? In historical memory, as I understand it. And right, that genocide, the Holocaust, was unique, right? It was intentional. The genocide wasn't a byproduct, right, of other things. It was the intent of that war. And I think the Jewish community generationally was felt compelled, right, to speak up against discrimination and racism, including discrimination and racism that it was facing here in the United States. So instead of the Rainbow Unicorn Coalition, what we saw, right, were strong leaders and organizations who came together. Now, look, not all the Black and Jewish community came together, But those leaders who found each other and built deep relationships for that 20th century civil rights movement fought and died and were beaten to get us to this moment. And here we stand in this moment, right? We are in the last 15 minutes of the fourth quarter, right, of the 1960 civil rights movement. And right in the distance, we can see the rise of the 21st century civil rights movement, right? It is slowly approaching. And our job is to not throw away the game in the last 15 minutes. As we know, most games, right, in sports are lost in the last minutes because people they're tired, right? They're exhausted, right? But we have to stay in this. Our ancestors, right, are owed their due. They suffered hard enough to get us to this point. So that keeps me motivated. I also still, at the end of the day, understand, right? It is also partly, it's not the only way, but it's also partly through this work that we have come to build diverse communities with one another, where we've had hard conversations. And what I've found, even across the political spectrum, right, is that primarily most people want to live, love, worship, and work free from fear, just as I did when I was a young seventh grader, just trying to make my way back and forth from school each and every day. But mostly these days, Judy, and I'll bring this to an end, what keeps me hopeful is this. About a year ago, I saw a video, and it was the daughter of George Floyd. George Floyd was an unarmed African-American man who was killed by law enforcement in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And as you know, large racial justice protests took place in this country that have transformed the conversation on racial justice. And I caught this footage of his daughter, Jana, and she was on the shoulders of a family member, a family friend, in the midst of one of these big marches, and tens of thousands of people and signs. And I was watching this video, and all of a sudden I heard her say something that just stunned me, right? She looked up and she looked around and she just said something like, my daddy changed the world, right? And I thought to myself, here's this young girl, right, who never gets her father back, right? Her father never gets a chance to teach her how to drive, never gets to teach her, right, how to dance, never gets to hand her off to her partner in marriage. This young girl doesn't get her father back. And it's unfair, right, that he was killed, but she was absolutely right. Her father did change the world. And I think to myself, what keeps me hopeful is this. It's a promise. That young girl is deserving of that future. She has the right to that changed world. And so does every young child, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, right? Our own children. They're deserving of that world. We've suffered enough, right? There is no reason to add to the suffering that already exists in this world. But we don't get there as a country together unless we begin to untwine anti-Semitism. And to do that, we first have to acknowledge that it exists and that it has a real impact and that it's driving social forces in this country who seek to undermine inclusive democracy, people-centered, accountable, transparent government. And I've watched all kinds of people stand up, right? I've watched white people, farmers in rural-based communities. I've watched law enforcement officers. I've watched military. I've watched health workers. I've seen the youngest kids stand up against bullies. And that's what gives me hope. At the end of the day, the drive to be human is stronger than the drive to be a bigot.
Thank you. There are a number of questions about anti-Semitism on the left and the right, terrifying wherever it's come from. I don't know if you just want to shed some light of where you see it, its center, like how are those of us, you know, the most progressive voices and the other voices, how do we comprehend where anti-Semitism is coming from?
Yeah, look, we have to first understand anti-Semitism first exists in society. So You don't often hear me talk about left or right anti-Semitism. You primarily hear me talk about anti-Semitism. In the same way, you never hear me talk about white anti-Semitism. And it's funny, no one ever talks about white anti-Semitism, but we're very quick to talk about Black anti-Semitism or Latino anti-Semitism as if it is somehow unique. And that's what we do with left and right anti-Semitism too. When we posit that way, it's already an apologetic in my sense. Here's the deal. Anti-Semitism exists. There are different types of anti-Jewish bigotry, right, and anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism we see on the right, is largely a racialized form of anti-Semitism. It's also a philo-Semitism, right? Anti-Semitism that comes off as a compliment. And a good parallel to this is when folks say to Black folks, you're so articulate, or you speak so well, right? Or you're such a great dancer, right? We recognize those as racial stereotypes, right? They may have been delivered to be compliments, but in fact, they're not. That's the type of anti-Semitism that you see on the right. The anti-Semitism that gets organized on the left, right, often largely revolves around two things: economic inequality, right, and human rights in Israel and Palestine, right? And the way that they manifest themselves is twofold. One is an overemphasis, right, on Jews, right? The idea that somehow they carry disproportionate power or influence, right? That is an anti-Semitic line, right? The second way, right, is the idea, right, that things that Jews, right, often, right, Jews are projected, right? The state of Israel is kind of a stand-in often for Jews, right? In the same way Soros is a stand-in for the Jews, or Rothschilds are a stand-in for Jews. And it is this idea that somehow when Jews do the same thing that other folks do, that somehow it carries a more ominous or nefarious intention, right? We can't just disagree with it like we would disagree with another country. We add layers of nefarious anti-Semitic imagery to it. That's how anti-Semitism largely plays out. But let's be clear, right? With that said, there's lots of reasons, right? We live in a country that has historically always been hostile and afraid of the left and populist movements, right? It's filled with people of color, right? And in this country, right, we like to focus on people of color, right? It's the same reaction, right? We see Black people as inherently more dangerous in this country because of systems of racism. And often we become more fixated on anti-Semitism in the left at the detriment, right, of the way that anti-Semitism is being organized for violence on the right. But with that said, Judy, look, anti-Semitism can play out anywhere, and it's why we need to be so vigilant around it. But the big difference is this: the anti-Semitism within the authoritarian white nationalist movement is central to their narrative. Anti-Semitism is not central to the narrative on the left, and on the right, it's a racialized form of anti-Semitism, right? It sees Jews as another form. And let me just give one example of the left to right divide and how it doesn't always play out in the way people think. As I said, about a year and a half ago, there were two attacks, one that happened in Brooklyn, one in Jersey City, and targeted primarily the Orthodox community. And there was actually physical assaults on the Orthodox community, but these were actual murders, killings that occurred. These were by African Americans, and simply because they were Black, right? They were framed as the left, right? Which I don't get. If you don't think that's racist, folks should check themselves, right? Just because someone's Black is not a definition of one's politics, right? And the folks who are engaging in that harassment, right, and in those murders, Their politics were not left-wing in any way, right? These were racist, far-right groupings. And so we have to understand that the far right is more likely to actualize their anti-Semitism in violence. But we can't tolerate anti-Semitism regardless of where it emanates. When it comes out of the left, we weaken our own civil and human rights movements, right? We wedge ourselves at a time where all of those who believe in the United States of America, emphasis on the united, need to have strong relationships with one another. We're going to go through hard times in this country. When the current president, Joe Biden, says this is going to be a long winter, right? I hope everyone understands he didn't mean the season, right? He was speaking metaphorically about the moment we are in right now. It's going to be a long one, right? And we don't make it through, right? As an American tribe, if we leave some of our people down in the valley, we have to move forward together. We can't move forward together if we're perpetrating bigotries on one another.
Thank you. We're getting to the end of our program, and I know there are many questions in the chat we're simply not going to get to. I urge everyone to look at the Western State Center website and start to follow Eric on social media, if you will, or start sign up for the newsletters coming out of the Western State Center, because that's going to give you a lot more information. Eric, I know, it's in a way, this is an unfair question. You are not a prophet, however.
No.
You think about revolutionary movements, and they do fizzle out. By the very definition of what they are, they can't last. Is it fair to think that white nationalism will fizzle out at some point?
If it can't institutionalize itself, it certainly will. But we're allowing it to institutionalize itself. Judy, just about, I think it was like 4 years ago, you may remember this. There was a big alt-right demonstration out in front of the Blues Festival here in Portland. And it was after a white nationalist had murdered 2 men on a light rail, 2 white men, by the way. 3 of them who didn't know each other put themselves between this white nationalist who was attempting to threaten these 2 young Black women, one who was Muslim. And when he couldn't get to them in frustration, right, he pulled out his knife and he cut the throats of 2 of these men who died right there on the light rail. Well, they followed up with demonstrations, right? When folks want to know why these physical confrontations are happening in Portland, it's because the white nationalist movement murdered someone. And but it wasn't just the white nationalist movement. What we often don't talk about is the day before those murders, that white nationalist attempted to do the same thing to a Black woman, right, on another light rail. And she happened to have pepper spray and pepper sprayed him. And he hit her in the head with a bottle. When the police came, the first thing they did was put this Black woman in handcuffs, right? And the second thing they did was to let this guy go. And the next night he committed those murders, right?
Yep.
That is the failure of our systems to stand up to white nationalism. And I think about this at that rally, this young white nationalist leader who's being harangued by someone who wanted to know why he was there, and no one wanted him there. And he responded by saying to this guy, yeah, I heard we're not wanted here, but Portland is a city with a shrinking Black population by both percentage and whole number, just like most urban areas in the United States, by the way. And then he went on to tell this guy, so you can say you don't want us here, but you're doing something we could never get away with, right? You are actually disappearing the Black community of Portland, Oregon. That was his response. He was calling us hypocrites. So we have to understand, right? You're right. There is an evolving and unfolding story here. And what's happened is that we think we don't need to evolve our story, right? We feel that the status quo is sufficient. But everywhere we look in the country, we should understand the status quo doesn't get us out of this moment. The white nationalist movement understands that. We need to be smart enough to understand that too. And we have to put forward real alternatives. We have to show what the future of this country looks like, right? because we are now in the future. And here's the deal, Judy. Wherever we're going, now we're here. And it's time for us to make real on where we are now. It's time to unpack, right, our furniture. It's time to help our neighbors build their barns, right? That is what it means to be brave in the 21st century civil rights movement. We have to begin to show people what this future looks like. And we can't do it in segregation. We can't do it in silos. And we can't do it transactionally, right? I'll only speak out against anti-Semitism if you're taking the correct stance on racism. Well, you didn't speak out on Israel and Palestine in the way I thought you should. So what am I doing defending Black Lives Matter? That is what 3-4-year-old toddlers do, right? We are supposed to be leaders, right, of a multiracial society that has never existed in history, right? Not acting like 3 or 4-year-olds. It's time for us to get serious. And I'm hopeful, and I remain hopeful, because every day I see more and more people taking themselves and our country with the seriousness that it deserves. We fought hard to get to this moment. Let's not throw it away.
Oh, Eric, thank you so much. And I'm writing something for a talk I'm giving next week, and I'll just say, you hit it. Love thy neighbor as thyself, right? What else should we be doing? I just want to thank you so much. Apologies for not being able to answer all the questions, but Eric, it's always what a privilege to be in conversation with you today. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining us this evening. I'm really grateful to the Baltimore Jewish Council, Jewish Museum of Maryland, really a shout out to Trillian Atwood and Saul Davis. I'm so excited to be working with you. Look forward to it again. There's information in the chat about all our organizations, including Western State Center. Just to remind you, this is the first in a 2-part series. The second takes place on Thursday night with Integrity First for America. There's also a link in the chat to get you signed up for that. There will be a survey that you're going to receive immediately following the program. We'd be grateful if you fill that out too. Thank you all. We look forward to seeing you soon. And remember, failure is impossible. Thank you so much and good night.